So, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, dear panelists, the first panel discussion of our conference will focus on the theory and practice of cultural research and cultural consumption. I think both are equally important. We cannot just stick to the theoretics. We need to explore how theory translates into practice. And I think from this point of view, we have a very interesting set of panelists on stage this afternoon. So this brings me to our first question. The research of cultural consumption has been evolving rapidly in response to global changes. What recent trends and developments do you think have had the most significant impact on cultural research, with particular emphasis on young people, and how have they influenced the questions we asked and the methods we use? And I suppose this is also a relevant question for Zsuzsanna, who is applies the findings of research in practice at her institution. Thank you.
Shall I start?
Yes, please.
Okay. So hello everyone. I am very glad to be at the panel, and I think I definitely represent the practice side, because I work for the House of Music Hungary, which is a new music venue, and we have a very special focus on music education and outreach. So that's why it is relevant, although we don't do academic research per se, and I think cultural consumption, especially among young people, is changing a lot in the sense of, so for example, we can see that the ticket buying is taking place much later, so it is very difficult to predict. And what kind of channels we are using to reach them out, it is also kind of, you have to be much more creative to reach them out. And that's why, for example, one of our initiation, which is taking place today and tomorrow, so if you are in Budapest, don't miss it out, that's the Intermezzo Festival, which is curated and also organized by the of the University of Applied Arts. So this is one of the kind of, one of our aim, to make sure that we have very kind of young curators as well, who can help us, and in this case, they are saying what is their music, what is their, preference, and in this way, we hope that we can engage more the young people as well. So I think this is what, and also I think how we kind of combine different genres, and not only music but also visual arts plays also a very important role.
Thank you. Professor Dr. Benczes, please elaborate on that with a brief introduction to us on how your discipline is and your professional experience is related to the research of culture.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. So to be honest with you, I'm a linguist. And within linguistics, my concern is about how we construct meaning. So I study, analyze, investigate meaning construction. Now, the paradigm of linguistics that I work in is called cognitive linguistics. And one of the main tenets of this particular theoretical framework is that meaning is not defined as such in a dictionary, but more rather it's pretty dynamic and fluid. And basically, language reflects societal values and judgments. So from this point of view, I think it's extremely fascinating to look at, for instance, how various age groups, of course, including younger age groups, look at, for instance, life, how they think about, how they talk about life. And this is one of the areas that I have been working in. And I can definitely say, at least from my point of view, is that there is a great degree of heterogeneity involved in, for instance, how the younger generation perceives or looks at, for instance, life. And it is very difficult, I'd say, to adopt, let's say, a straightforward category that just because somebody belongs to a particular age group is going to adopt a certain perspective. Our research more rather indicates that this is a more varied picture. And when it comes to, for instance, Hungarian teenagers, how they perceive an abstract concept of life, the perhaps most important factor is the type of secondary school they go to, whether it is, for instance, a grammar school or a less prestigious secondary school, or what is the level of education of their mother. So anyway, give the word to the others as well.
Thank you. Dr. Solea?
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a cultural manager with a background in music, musicologist. And I have to say that the biggest challenge, as far as I see it during the last few years, is represented by the digital revolution, the technological revolution. Because this has produced and is producing changes. We are aware of some changes. Other changes are going to be seen. We are moving on fast forward. So the changes are at the level of the way we are consuming, so the consumption patterns, first of all, but also at the level of the products, the cultural goods and services that we are proposing for the market. And of course, inside this, when we have to make reference to the marketing strategies, we notice, for example, different age categories and ways of understanding and consuming art in this specific situation. So I would say that, according to me, this is, let's say, the game changer that we are nowadays facing, and we have to understand and we have to adapt. So I'm not going to elaborate on this because I'm sure we are going to have the opportunity to speak further about these aspects.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. We have touched upon the generational differences, but I think it's worth examining them from another angle, because one of the ongoing challenges in cultural research is exactly the generation gap reflected by different cultural consumption habits of various age groups in society, even within generations, because of the increasingly rapid change in media consumption, in social attitudes, in values. But we can also talk about how a social status influences cultural consumption, which is also a very interesting aspect, I think. So my question is, how can those researching cultural consumption from either a theoretical or practical approach, let's say as leader or a senior member of staff at a museum or a house of music, a concert hall or a gallery, keep up with increasingly rapid change, and how can these findings be translated into practice?
Okay. So this is a very good question, as a matter of fact. Due to these continuous challenges that we are facing, and here we can have another conversation on the cultural and creative industries, because there are different industries, and every industry reacts to these challenges in a specific way. I have to say that the visual arts, and especially the institutions that are in this sector, like for example the museums, are trying to integrate, are trying to make use of the digital technology in order to reach the younger audiences or different categories of audiences. And an example comes to my mind at this point is the Archaeological Museum of Naples. They have created an amazing video game, so they have included the video games inside their activities in order to address, for example, children of different age categories. The video game is called Father and Son, and it has different levels of integration. So the first level is like you get acquainted with what happens inside the museum. It's like the historical perspective, and then little by little, the aim of the video game is to play it and to come inside the museum. museum. So once you step inside the museum as a child, you already know what happens there. So this is amazing also from the point of view of the storytelling. And this is another interesting perspective in relation to the storytelling and how this is being included, integrated, and gets to children, of course, through the digital technology. I'm not a fan of the digital technology in the sense that I totally love it, but I think we have to integrate it, to make use of it in order to improve as well as we can our fields of activity. And in this situation, we speak about arts and culture. But of course, there are many pros and cons when we have to make reference to how the digital technology can be integrated, can change in a positive, can have a positive or negative effect towards these sectors. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think it's also an extremely important and interesting question. And what I can say is that at Corvinus we have quite a few doctoral students who are working on various topics related to digital consumption and what sort of effect does this have on various societal groups, among others. And of course, the problem with this is that this is such a fast-pacing field that very often the trends change so quickly that, let's say, somebody starts a PhD research, but in 2 or 3 years' time, and it's still very far when this person is going to finish, maybe that particular program, software or trend or whatever has shifted into something else. So I think it's a huge challenge for the academia as well to somehow run after all these various changes and to offer some kind of a valid response to what is going on. And that's going to be, well, maybe even more difficult as we proceed. I don't know.
Yeah, at the House of Music we have a sound dome, which is actually an amazing kind of audiovisual experience. So there's a 360 dome, and then there are the music and the sound is coming from 27 different channels. So it is like a community AR experience, which is, I think, very much for young people, not only as audience, but also as creators. And yeah, we are, yeah, for me this kind of generation gap, I wasn't quite sure what the question referred to, but like, focusing on young people, definitely, digital age or digital tools, they are very much at home with these kind of digital tools, and that's why we have different installation, we have different collaborations. So for example, tomorrow there is going to be a presentation of a piece of music by a Hungarian composer, Péter Ötvös, and 5 different students are created different installation for that. So it's, it's an interpretation, it's a visual interpretation to music. So I think that is very interesting how we can kind of engage them.
May I add something in relation to this aspect, the way digital technology is being addressed or should be addressed by different age categories of consumers. So I have recently came across a study stating that the digital technology can have a bad effect over the development of the brain, especially when we speak about children, very young children. So from this point of view, let's say the pros and cons of the digital technology in the arts sector opens up the door to many questions, and there are a lot of research that have been, as a matter of fact, published by doctors in the United States and also in Europe. So now we are going to see some changes from this point of view. So how are we going to address through the digital technology the younger audience? How much they are going to be exposed to this? What type of products or services, cultural products or services, are we going to make available for them? So let's say that I just wanted to add this small comment.
Thank you.
Just one more remark, in fact, just to add to this, that all this, of course, raises the question of not just how to deal with this, let's say, within the scope of PhD research, which quite a lot of our students are coping with, but also as university instructors how to deal with this in the classroom. And the reason why I'm saying this is that one of our PhD students is working on, for instance, how can VR technologies be used within a classroom setting to enhance rhetorical skills within a university classroom. This is also a constant point of discussion within our department, our institute, and the university as a whole as such, how to make sure that we are able to, let's say, upkeep the attention of our students. This is going sometimes towards edutainment, I'm afraid. I absolutely agree with that. And, the notion of gamification, how can that be brought into higher education? So these are constant issues and aspects that we have to talk about, and then we have to, of course, somehow solve, if possible.
And I think that's what you also mentioned, that refers to the decrease of concentration span. So how do we react in the programming for the change of concentration span? And it's not only among young people, but for example, we tend also in classical music, we tend not to have concert with intervals, but we have 70 minutes concerts, so that there is a focus.
During the coronavirus pandemic, many believed that the era of large in-person events could be over for more than just a year or two. And of course, although we know that this never happened, in fact, as the previous conversation, we could hear that the visits to libraries in Hungary actually increased after the pandemic, and our research also reflects that the young people have an increased desire and motivation to join real in-person communities and attend events in person. Figures also reflect that in-person attendance had been declining prior to the coronavirus and independently from the coronavirus pandemic. Let me share one revealing figure, or two in fact, with you. The last wave of the Hungarian large sample use survey, which was conducted on an 8,000 member sample in late 2020, showed that almost half of young Hungarians between the ages of 15 and 29 never attend a concert. So not during the pandemic, of course, not in the past year, but never. So 1 in 2 never attend concerts. And of course, as for classical music, which is also very relevant to our conversation today, the most recent research we have conducted on this, which is published in the research report booklets that have been handed out and are also available bilingually online, show that classical music is only listened to at some frequency by only a small fraction, about 1/10 of young Hungarians. So obviously it is evident that the digital age has transformed the way we interact with culture, from social media to streaming platforms. How has, in your opinion, the digital landscape reshaped the study and practice of culture, and what benefits can traditionally elitist forms of culture, such as classical music, draw from free for all platforms?
Yeah, why should people listen to classical music? So why is it that, I am coming from a classical music field, so I'm not against classical music, but why do we talk more about classical music than about jazz, pop, and different genres? And I think what digital tools can help us. For example, I think what is a very important initiatives in Hungary is e-Színház, which is a theater streaming platform, and we also kind of stream a lot of our performances. And I think one of the most important things as well, that we can reach out outside Budapest as well. So there can be an audience who wouldn't be able or who wouldn't come to our performances can watch our performances streamed. It is also like it's also in classical music research. It shows that like streaming doesn't reduce but increase the live audience, because like people say that, oh wow, I watched this, I would like to see it live. So this is like, again, when we are talking about streaming as a threat, then this is proven to be totally different. And yes, I think that's important to use the digital tools and like see what can be the advantage, how can we expand our audience, and how can we expand, for example, the interactivity of our audience, because this gives obviously opportunities for audience and artist interactions as well. And for example, as for classical music, we are trying and we are pretty successful to attract new audiences. And basically, we are doing a lot of related arts. So visual arts, we also sometimes pantomime or theater or different kind of art forms. Or we have also kind of science in connection to musical pieces. So then also people who are interested in the related arts would come to our concerts.
Because I'm coming from the same sector. So I think that the streaming services have brought a plus, so they are an important aspect for the music industry, because it allows the access to everyone. We can all listen, and this has happened also even more during the pandemic, to listen to a concert. Even festivals have been organized online. But in the same time, when we speak about performing arts, there is the need to attend this type of events live. And why is that? Probably we are asking ourselves, because there is a special type of connection, an experience that the public has when it attends a live event, which is that communication, the transmission of emotions, the relation with the artist, but also with the other members of the public. Because we speak about social aspects. We have this need for interaction, and this is something that has been proven also during the pandemic. Despite the fact that we all had access to internet and has saved our lives from a certain point of view, but live events in sense of participation of the public are a need. Then there is another problem in relation to that, because we speak about audience development. So classical music, unfortunately, is a niche sector. The public is getting older and older. The problem is to attract, and how do we attract the younger public? And here, when we have to analyze the younger public, we have to consider different type of challenges, a lot of information that is coming towards us through internet, too much information, as a matter of fact. The globalization process. So I'm going to do what the others are going to do. So it's not so trendy, for example, also the social status to go to a classical concert when I can go and see something else. And in respect to this, many organizations are trying, institutions are trying to find a way to reach the younger audience. So an option would be this, to involve different performing arts, which is a good strategy because you are addressing a wider category of public. But in the same time, it can also be done through educational programs. So many organizations have this educational department where they try to involve young people in different types of cultural projects, musical projects. And this, as a matter of fact, I can also give some examples in a bit in relation to what this means. And of course, last but not least, maybe we can integrate somehow the digital aspects. Fast it becomes more appealing for the younger audience to interact, to come and see. Unfortunately, for the performing arts, for the classical music, we cannot integrate so much of the digital technologies. I mean, we can do some projects, but it's not 100% as it happens in other situations. Like it happens in the visual arts, for example, where we can also have the digital art. Let's say that I see this problem, something that everyone is dealing with. How do we address the audience development, and how do we attract the younger public through our programs? Can be also a change in the programs. So everyone, as a matter of fact, right now is brainstorming around these aspects. And another aspect would be to bring the classical music, as sometimes it might even appear like, the niche sector. People not going because they have never been there, or maybe because they see the classical music venues as something untouchable, like a temple where I have never been. I have never been to the opera house. Why should I go? I mean, I don't know what happens there. I'm afraid. I'm ashamed. I have also had some students, unfortunately, they were living, let's say, outside the city, and I was asking them, have you ever been to see a classical music concert or maybe at the opera house? No, I have never been. And why is that? I did not have the opportunity, and then of course the opportunity was not even generated by the university or other bodies, or maybe even by parents. So what happens is we can actually take music in the middle of the communities. And thus, they can feel comfortable, it can be an informal interaction for the public, and they can start to see little by little. This happens, for example, in a concert venue, classical concert venue. Let's do it again. Maybe let's also go there and see what happens.
I think you have just touched upon a very topical question, namely accessibility, which can be meant in a variety of senses. The physical sense, I think we have made a lot of progress on that to enable people with limited mobility to physically access concert venues and events venues over the past decades. But we could also mention accessibility in communications to provide plain and accessible communications on event which do not appear exclusionary or elitist. I think this is very relevant in the case of classical music or classical art. And accessibility also in the sense that the financial squeeze across the world has meant that ticket prices have been rising across the globe, and I think a lot of people, especially young people who often experience or at least in certain countries and settings, low salaries, unemployment or underemployment, not in Hungary so much, but certainly in Southern Europe, for example, are no longer able to attend because the prices are just so high. So I wonder whether you could perhaps elaborate on that.
That is a very good question, but I would like to say that unless we are experiencing the first concert of the season, the first performance that takes place at Teatro alla Scala, just to give an example, which is very expensive, usually the prices, if we have to make a comparison between the classical music concerts, performances, and so-called popular music concerts, are much smaller. I mean, I'm just thinking about the concert to attend Coldplay. I mean, I love Coldplay, just don't get me wrong, but it's like from over 150 euros, something like this. And when instead we can also purchase a ticket to see an opera performance or even a classical music concert in a different venue, where the prices, let's say, are 20, 30, maybe even 40 euro, depending exactly on the venue and on the place in the venue. So from this point of view and of the sustainability, economic sustainability, I can say that unfortunately, especially in the case of the public music organization, they are just gaining a small revenue in terms of ticket sales. First of all, because they don't have the public. Secondly, because the prices are not at the level of their expenses. I mean, cannot cover the expenses. And this is a situation of mostly, of course, the public music organization, the public performing arts organizations. Have I answered the question?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, I think just kind of one reaction that why do young people have to go to classical music? So classical music has always been a genre which is for over 50. So for example, what we say that I think this is a good kind of trend as well, that we are trying to attract young people as well. But there's a lot of senior people who are going to classical music, and there aren't programs for them because everybody's saying that we want to attract young people. So we are doing, for example, a senior club with classical music, and it's immensely popular. So there are fights for tickets. So, I think I do understand that I think it's good to attract different audiences, but we can also accept that, okay, we have to pay attention to music education, and then we will have the people over 50 to come to classical music concert, and that's fine.
Well, I can't say much about music, but it seems to me that the problems that maybe you face as getting, let's say, people to listen more to classical music or inviting them into a classical concert does resonate with how to attract more students and even better students into university, or how to make sure that they, let's say, listen to a lecture on the theories of communication from the first minute until the 90th minute. Just to respond what Ferenc mentioned in the beginning about COVID, I think that COVID was a real game changer in the sense that how we, let's say, taught maybe pre-COVID was rather different to how we are now trying to teach, how we're now trying to instruct post-COVID, because somehow the attention span or what is expected from us with respect to how we keep up the attention, I think has in fact changed a lot, even within a university setting, and that is in fact something that is challenging to do. Maybe there are some similarities in this respect, I'd say.
And how do you face that, or what do you do? What do you do differently, if I may ask a question? Because I think that's very interesting.
Well, I think I have plenty of colleagues who are much better at this. I have lots of younger colleagues who are simply fantastic in adopting all sorts of new programs, software into the teaching, into the classes. I mentioned gamification, which is extremely trendy nowadays in the academia. So using game-like, let's say, all sorts of things to make teaching, let's say, more interesting or colorful or whatever. But generally, it is expected to have, let's say, more visuals, more visualizations. Let's say to show things through, let's say, videos that we're also expected to, let's say, stream things just simply to highlight various points that we're trying to make it as interactive as possible. So in this respect, I guess it's the same wherever we go.
I think it's a matter of personal preference too. So, for example, the other day I had a conversation with someone on museums, and I expressed my personal opinion also as a historian that I prefer classical museums. So, museums where there are exhibits, descriptions, and I go primarily, when I go to a museum, I go in to learn. And it's similar, in my case at least, with classical music. I'm not an expert on classical music, unfortunately, but when I do go to classical music, obviously, concert, it's an event for me, and something that is has an important place in my diary, so to speak. But when I do go, I go to learn something new, and I don't think necessarily gamification, which is in many people's understanding when you play games, is kind of the opposite of learning. So I feel a certain tension between these two, but this is just my own personal opinion.
Well, this is another approach. As a matter of fact, I'm part of a project that is called Piano Express at the moment. So we have considered the fact that we need to educate the public, younger audience. So what we are doing is to create to propose performances, classical music performances, with a program that suits younger generations, involving, for example, actors or different instrumentalists, and explaining and interacting all the time. So the artists are explaining, are interacting with the audience, because this is the best way to do the education. The same happens, or it should happen as a matter of fact, in all the concert venues. So the talks before the concert, where the artist or maybe the conductor or maybe the artistic director of the organization meets the public and tries to explain the program and explain the different aspects that are connected with the program, which I think is highly important. Unfortunately, they are not being implemented on a continuous basis. I have seen a couple, for example, at the Rome Opera House, because they don't have the time, they don't have the means, or they don't consider this as being necessary. So, and there was another, when I was working for the Roman Philharmonic, I remember there were like the concert taking place at 6. So before the concert there was like an aperitivo, which in Italian means like you have a drink and you have something to eat in an informal venue in the lobby, for example. They were meeting and interacting, and all the elements of the concert were being presented and explained to them. So this is another way to see it. And the family concerts as well. This is a new format involving the entire family, because education is not only for the small ones but also for the parents as well, and try to make it as appealing, as attractive as possible.
Yeah, it is very interesting what you mentioned, and we are organizing kind of this kind of artist talk with all our concerts, or with like 90%. And what is the most difficult one is to persuade pop musicians to have any kind of artist talk, because they said like the music are talking for itself, that's unnecessary, and they are the least open to these kind of conversations.
We've spoken about how, briefly, about how cultural research often intersects with other disciplines such as sociology, psychology, communications, linguistics, and anthropology. Could you please share examples of successful interdisciplinary approaches in cultural research and discuss the benefits and challenges of collaboration across academic boundaries?
I can start with that. First of all, cultural management is an extremely wide and complex sector. Because when we speak about cultural management, we speak about putting together arts and management. So business sector, using management tools, with the artistic, the performing arts sector. While in the same time, when we speak about cultural projects, so the cultural projects are extremely complex. They address the needs of a community. The most successful cultural projects, either we speak about events, one-time events for the type of exhibitions, or maybe even festivals that are highly important, as a matter of fact, from different points of view for the communities. They are addressing the needs of a community. So, of course, we are part of a community. Each of us is part of a specific community, and we have cultural needs, we have economic needs, we have social needs, and when we speak about social aspects, we can also connect with the psychological perspective as well. So I can also refer to the Abraham Maslow pyramid of needs. So physiological needs at the basis, psychological needs moving towards the top of the pyramid. So this happens in the case of the cultural projects. We position ourselves towards the top of this pyramid, and we, let's say, vibrate. We connect with the needs of the human beings that are more sophisticated. So we need to feel part of a community. This is why we need to engage with the other members of the community. We also need to, let's say, have that ecstatic moment when we are listening, we are seeing a performance, we are listening to a concert, and we have that perspective, we can call it towards beauty. We feel fulfilled, we feel satisfied. So all these elements are highly sophisticated. Probably this is why when we speak about cultural projects, it's complex and it's difficult to analyze and to understand which is the best perspectives when we have to put on paper and to explain precisely. This is why we need to implement this project. There is also let's say, a project that is called Sound Diplomacy, developed by a professor as well as researcher. His name is Shane Shapiro. And he focuses on the impact of the music organization, so the music ecosystem, in different parts of the world. He tries to analyze how this influences the well-being of the communities, of a specific community in that situation. And in respect to that, there are different examples around the world. The main problem is when we have to analyze, and why do we need to analyze the cultural projects? Why do we need to put all the elements on paper? Well, because in function of this, we can also, first of all, support the fact that culture is important as a sector, that there is a creative economy that is associated with the cultural sector as well, that produces jobs as well as an important revenue overall. And of course, we also need to do that because we need to convince the different, political representatives, the governments, different institutions to support our projects. So there are different perspectives. Of course, no profit, for profit, in function of the business model. This is something more, let's say, complex that can be elaborated further. But in terms of the impact, and there is an initiative that is called Cases for Culture, developed, or it has been developed by Harvard Business School. So there are specific cultural examples that are being analyzed from different points of view. Not all the elements are being taken into consideration, so this is something we can even further analyze. Or another important example is El Sistema. Have you heard about El Sistema? El Sistema is an amazing project that was developed in the 70s, was started in Venezuela by Abreu. And why was that? Because he wanted to save the children of Venezuela that were living in poor conditions, very poor conditions. So they were living on the streets, exposed to drug dealers, and he said, we can, create this project, involve the children, give them specific skills, fast they can afterwards, just get off the streets and make a life for themselves, even if they are not going to be cultural professionals, artists, and so on. So he has created El Sistema, which afterwards has been, as a matter of fact, developed in different parts of the world. Nevertheless, the impact is different in function of the needs of every community. So since the 70s, he has succeeded because he was an economist as well as with a lot of interest in the music sector as well, to create a project that became sustainable, having the support of the government. They have saved the life of hundreds of thousands of children of Venezuela. There is also a hierarchy. There are different, as a matter of fact, movies about this project that can be seen even on YouTube, which I think is the best example on how a cultural project can address the needs of a community, but also when we speak about the impact of the cultural project, it's not something that we can measure straight ahead. Sometimes it's, let's say, something that we can see in some years, maybe 10 years, maybe 15 years. So this is why it becomes even more difficult to convince the political factors to support us and to tell them, you can and you need and you have to support us, to give us the money to develop this project, because on long term, this is what we do for the community. So this was in relation to, yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for this question. I was actually hoping that you would ask this. As I mentioned at the very beginning, I work with language, and one of the general assumptions that I make is that societal values are reflected in the language that we use. We actually construct reality through language. There is no objective truth out there. This also means, of course, that when we look at how we talk about certain concepts, gives a reflection of what are those cultural norms and cultural values that, let's say, influence this kind of way of conceptualizing, of talking about things. And just to give you, let's say, just very, very simple examples here, how we talk about men and women, various stages in their lives. If we think about extremely common words like, let's say, bachelor versus spinster, these have very different connotations, even though by definition, in a dictionary, all that exists about them is that they all refer to an older man or an older woman who is unmarried. Nevertheless, while bachelor has no pejorative, let's say, meanings attached to it, spinster is clearly a pejorative term. Similarly, if we just consider something really basic like old man and old woman, then old man, let's say, might more rather bring about connotations about, let's say, somebody having wisdom. More rather, in the case of an old woman, the connotation is more rather concerned with, let's say, the physical appearance of this person. So let's say looking visually old. Of course, these are very basic examples, but they clearly, I think, show that we pack a lot of these let's say, perceptions, how society functions, how we think society should function, all of this, the stereotypes into word meanings. And whenever we use, of course, words, we rely on all this encyclopedic knowledge that surrounds these particular words. And whenever we talk about the linguistic community, then, of course, these particular encyclopedic elements of word meanings are in fact shared to some extent. Nevertheless, one of the most fascinating things that we can also see is that there are differences with respect to what sort of elements are in fact shared within a society. There is a branch of linguistics called cultural linguistics, which looks at what sorts of cultural frames of knowledge, cultural metaphors, cultural concepts, let's say, can be found in a particular language that identify or that give rise to a particular linguistic community. Just to illustrate one example, and I'll stop there. For instance, if we look at metaphorical conceptualization, which is in fact one of my research areas, so how we make sense of abstract concepts through, let's say, metaphors. It has been shown in previous research that if we look at American English and how American English speakers talk about life, the all-pervasive, let's say, metaphor that we can cite here for American English speakers is life is entertainment. This doesn't mean that American English speakers, of course, can't think about life in any other way, including life is a gift, or life is a journey, or life is a challenge, or whatever. But this is an all-pervasive metaphor that, let's say, can be thought of as a cultural metaphor. However, it has also been claimed that if we look at Hungarian speakers, then this all-pervasive cultural metaphor, if we can call it as such, is life is a struggle or / war. Now, this, of course, does depict things in a rather negative way. But with a couple of colleagues, we have been challenging, in fact, this particular idea. And it has been, what we have found is that when it comes to, in fact, younger adults in Hungary, and especially, well, teenagers and young adults, life is struggle, war doesn't even surface as a particular, let's say, all-pervasive metaphor. And Hungarian teenagers and Hungarian young adults share exactly the same cultural metaphors for life as, for instance, American English speakers. Now, whether this is due to globalization or whatever, I don't know, but it clearly shows that even if we wish to generalize over, let's say, cultural metaphors, we can't really do that, because if we start to look at the various groups, then there are going to be fascinating differences for which, of course, we have to search the reasons elsewhere. Thank you.
Our time is running short, but I have one final question before we open up the floor to our audience. Cultural sensitivity and respect for cultural differences are essential in research. How can researchers and cultural management professionals navigate the complexities of working with cultures that are not their own, and what strategies can they employ to build trust and establish meaningful relationships between communities through culture? Thank you.
I think diversity is always a kind of, so I, as well as working at the House of Music Hungary, I am working at a university in Vienna as well. And you know, how we kind of approach diversity and how we address the issues of diversity is very different than I think in many different countries. And for example, we have kind of dilemmas that we had a festival which is called, you know, Other Cultures, and then we discussed it, and especially focusing on those people who lived also abroad, that, like, you know, we cannot address this because this is coming from a kind of patronizing perspective. So I think it is very important that like what we want to present. So we work I think all the management, but I am personally very much a network person. So we work with international organizations, especially the cultural institutes which are accredited in Hungary. And we try to kind of make sure that we have an equal representation of different cultures. And we are also kind of inviting different artists. So we work a lot with the cultural institutions in order to show different cultures in a diverse and progressive way. So I think I think these kind of discourses are at a very different level than I think many other countries.
Okay. Okay, so I think cultural diversity is a richness. I will make reference to a research that was published in 2015, so it's a little bit outdated, but nevertheless is important because it was performed at international level, global level, so it's called Cultural Times, published by UNESCO in collaboration with Ernst & Young. And they have tried to see exactly the impact of the creative economy, of the cultural and creative industries. So we speak about a large area of arts, but also creative industries that are associated with the arts sector. And what they have noticed is that, let's say the globe trendsetter on the first place is Asia and Pacific, because we speak about an area that is developing very fast from the economic point of view, used to develop, now we are going to see what happens with China. But on the second place, it was Europe. Europe, because in Europe we have the biggest cultural diversity possible, the highest number of universities, of arts universities, of art schools, museums. Let's say 3-4 of the most visited museums in the world are based in Europe. Not to speak about the head offices of the most important players. Either we speak about the music industry or we speak about the advertising, but also the publishing industry as well. So this tells quite a lot because we are trendsetters from the artistic point of view. Another important aspect that we can also experience, for example, I'm experiencing just visiting the city, is the cultural tourism, which is an important branch, part of the tourist sector, but as well as culture that is placed at the very center of tourism, which also enables to witness that economic growth we are all speaking about. So I would say that cultural diversity is highly important for us, that if we are working in the cultural sector and we are cultural professionals, we have to make use of the cultural diversity to understanding and being open-minded towards different cultures. Either we speak about different parts of the world. This is, we are helped through the globalization process, if we have to take a look at the pros aspect of the globalization process. But in the same time, it must be done respecting entirely the diversity of a different culture, respect to our culture. So I'm developing projects not only in Europe but also in different parts of the world. I have to say that I'm enjoying that very much because I like to get to know different cultures. I like to learn. So this is how we have to do. We have to learn all the time. And not only that, but if we have to just put it like this, it's clear that culture cannot stop a war or cannot stop a bullet directly. But arts, culture, cultural education, education in general, if we take a look on long term, can prevent a war because we speak about the education of the future generations, can stop a bullet. And if we have to analyze the reasons of different wars, I'm not going to get into this because I'm not in the political science or the political sector, but what has generated is also the level of fear. People are afraid of things they don't know. They have not been taught to be open-minded. They are too conservative from certain points of view. It's good to be conservative, but it's also good to be open-minded and try to understand a little bit and try to have an equilibrium between the two perspectives, because this is going just to complete ourselves.
Well, I think these were wonderful thoughts, and I'm not sure if I can really add anything extra to this. The only thing I can say is that I did a bit of homework before I came here, and I checked on Google Scholar the expression youth culture, and it was interesting to see that there were about 5 million hits on Google Scholar with youth culture. But when I started scrolling through the various links, what I saw is that, let's say, on the first 3 or 4 pages of all the various hits, very few of them came from, let's say, recent years. So there were very few recent publications on Google Scholar about youth culture when I put this into the search engine. And it got me thinking, why is it? Of course, I could have scrolled through at least 100 more pages, which I didn't really have time to do, unfortunately. So this is not a representative survey at this point. What I thought of is that maybe both the labels youth and culture, in fact, are very ambiguous. And if we think about youth, then who are we to decide or to say who constitutes youth? Youth is, I'd say, prototypically referred to maybe as teenagers, but what we can see now is that this is being extended downward to maybe the preteen groups. But we can also say that youthfulness is being extended upward. So what we can see is that we see all sorts of youthful seniors. And it has been shown that nowadays, due to the fact that we do spend more time at school and we get into adult responsibilities at a later age, therefore, let's say, the idea of what is youth or youthful is being extended upward. And various people, let's say, like artists, in fact, and athletes, typically are able to prolong youthfulness because of the things that they do. And then, of course, there's this other problematic term, such as culture itself, which I'd say more rather works in the plural, like cultures. And what we can rather see is that even if we look at various subcultures, and I know that even subculture is a problematic term in academic research, the trend seems to be the case that these are not considered as subcultures in the sense of going against the mainstream culture, but they are simply parallel cultures, parallel independent cultures to themselves, which exist side by side. So there's a great degree of cultural heterogeneity all around, I'd say, which we have to be aware of.
Thank you. And with that, I would like to open up the floor to our audience. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to raise your hand, and my colleague at the back will provide you with a microphone. There's one question here in the middle.
Thank you. That was very, very interesting set of discussions. I am based at a university in the UK. I'm interested in the question of gamification. My research is on generational differences. And it seems that there are two dynamics at play in this discussion. One is the pedagogical innovation discussion. You know, as a teacher, you want to bring students to where you want to get them to be. So that requires using new technology, as far as I can see, and often new techniques. On the other hand, the way it tends to go in the UK is that gamification becomes very generic. You know, so actually what happens is the content goes, the knowledge base goes, it is called interdisciplinary, but it is kind of fairly meaningless often. And the other problem is that obviously young people are so far ahead of lecturers in terms of the technology they use that it's not actually fun for them. And so I just wondered how we might get the balance between those two tensions.
Excuse me, since we're running slightly short on time, if there are any further questions, please raise your hand and we can collect them. But yes, there's one further question.
You were discussing different types of audiences. My question is, do you have a problematic group of people who are difficult to address? Who you seem to be missing out on? Yeah, and I found Professor Benczes' remarks very, very important about language. So museum communication, exhibition communication has to be cautious, not to hurt any of these groups who you may miss because they don't feel talked to. So that's the question. Who is missed and who is miscommunicated?
Thank you.
Yeah, I think like for us, House of Music, definitely the teenagers. So we are using for example electronic music and interactive workshops, but really reaching out teenagers who are coming to the House of Music from their own will, or so not from its schools. That is very much challenging, and I think this is also an interesting of the setting. So that's why, for example, House of Music is very kind of actively participating in summer festival. So Colorado, Inota, and those kind of festivals, which maybe not the teenagers, but like the young adults are represented. But I think, how to really engage teenagers, that's not only a problem for the parents.
Yes, I would consider the teenagers, but also children. They are not problematic, but they need to be addressed properly. Probably we haven't done that so far. We need to pay attention also in terms of communication, so marketing strategy. We need to focus on developing proper marketing strategies for different age categories, but also in terms of program that is being developed by cultural organizations. We should also try to address and to include performances, artists that can attract the younger audiences, and little by little we can also involve them in different types of cultural activities as well. This has been done, I'm thinking about LA Philharmonic and the fact that they were having this problem, their audience was older, getting older and older, so their problem was how are we going to address the younger audience, how are we going to do this refresh of our audience, and in the same time, how are we going to address the community and to include the different members of the community, because there is also an important Latino community in LA based. So what they did was changing slightly the program, involving also a summer season, for example, by addressing different types of artistic programs in order to involve the larger community. As well as in Walt Disney Hall, they have kept the classical music concerts, but also adding different elements, for example, increasing the quality of the performances, involving younger artists, which also attract as well, because if you see, okay, there is a young orchestra that is performing, a youth orchestra invited from different parts of the world, as well as a young conductor or maybe even emerging artists. This also somehow addresses and represents an example for the younger audience. And of course, also in terms of strategy, I'm getting back to that communication. How do we communicate? We need to select professionals that are able to communicate with different age categories, because this is not the same. I mean, we have used so far, sometimes, and I have noticed that sometimes even not marketing professionals that had some knowledge in the cultural sector. They just involve different types of language, so they witness difficulties in addressing even older audiences. I have seen this for different festivals, for example. So now we are speaking about marketing professionals that understand the cultural sector, understand the specific arts they are addressing or organization they are working for, as well as inside this, we also speak about different age categories and how we can communicate using a proper language with the different age categories of our public.
I'll just respond to the question concerning gamification very quickly. It took me quite a long time to learn how Kahoot operates, to be honest. And eventually I did. But by the time I did manage to get the hang of it, whenever I say, oh, here's a Kahoot now, I just get groans from my students. So I absolutely agree with you, and I've got no idea what to do about this. I don't think I'll ever be able to have that kind of knowledge or expertise that they expect me to have. And I'll just be constantly probably running, in lag of what is being used by them. As opposed to miscommunication, I think that the power of words is huge. It's all in the name. Just to cite a very recent research that I've carried out with colleagues, with my colleagues at Corvinus and at an Australian university, we looked at how Australian media talks about depression, late onset depression. So this means depression that affects older generations. It's a huge medical problem all around the world, of course, including Australia and Hungary as well. Nevertheless, it's an illness that is very rarely talked about because, well, for one reason, older people don't generally take it seriously because they think it's just got to do with being old. And also it's a taboo topic. So what we wanted to see, that if we look at Australian newspapers, how is this discussed, if it is discussed at all? And we focused on two very common labels that Australian English uses for referring to older people. One of them is the elderly, and the other one is seniors. So we took out all of the articles in Australian media spanning about 30 years that contained these two expressions that was connected to an article on depression. And what was fascinating to see is that when newspapers, when journalists used the term the elderly, a completely different type of frame activation based on the kind of words that we found in the article was brought up with, in opposition to seniors. So if it's the elderly, then they basically can't escape depression. They will definitely be depressed in their older age. If they do get depressed, because eventually they won't be able to get out of it, or with extreme hardship. As opposed to seniors, seniors only run the risk of being depressed, but probably they are more aware of what depression is. Therefore, the chances of them getting depressed is much, much less. And even if they do get depressed, this is not a permanent state, but only a temporary condition out of which they have multiple ways of getting out of. And this is purely on the level of two labels used for older people interchangeably in Australian media, and quite simply inactivates very different conceptual frames, showing how very important it is that we know what are the labels with which we address our audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and that brings our conversation on cultural research this afternoon to an unfortunate end. Thank you very much for your valuable contributions, Réka, Benczes, Zsuzsanna, Szálka, and Alexandra, Solea. Our conference is continuing today with the so-called World Cafe discussions, featuring our selected PhD students and their posters, and afterwards from next morning at this very same venue. So we do hope to see as many of you as possible tomorrow too. Again, thank you very much for our panelists for accepting our invitation, and also for the audience for their attention this evening.